Paris, the morning of July 14, 1789. Bread is scarce. Wages have not kept up with prices. For months, crowds have gathered outside bakeries before dawn, only to be turned away with empty hands and bitter words. In the coffee houses and gardens of the Palais Royal, pamphlets and speeches denounce corruption, privilege, and royal ministers. Above the streets, the political crisis that began in the spring is reaching a breaking point. Just weeks earlier, France's monarchy had tried a last resort. After years of war debt, court expense, and a tax system that weighed heavily on commoners while shielding many nobles, King Louis XVI summoned the Estates General, a representative body that had not met since 1614. In May 1789, deputies from the three estates, clergy, First Estate, nobility, Second Estate, and commoners, Third Estate, convened at Versailles. Hopes ran high that the king would agree to reforms. But arguments over voting procedures, whether to vote by order, which favored elites, or by head, which favored the much larger Third Estate, quickly deadlocked the assembly. In June, the Third Estate, joined by some reform-minded clergy and nobles, broke with precedent. They declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the nation as a whole. Barred from their meeting hall one day, they gathered instead in a nearby tennis court and swore not to disband until France had a constitution. The famous tennis court oath of June 20th, 1789. To reformers, this was a bold step toward constitutional monarchy and national sovereignty. To conservative courtiers and some royal advisors, it looked like rebellion. Around Paris and Versailles, royal troops, many of them foreign regiments considered more reliable, were brought closer to the capital. At the same time, Louis XVI vacillated, sometimes making concessions, sometimes listening to hardline counselors. On July 11th, he dismissed Jacques Necker, the popular finance minister seen as sympathetic to reform. When news of Necker's fall reached Paris, it ignited panic and rage. On July 12th, in the gardens of the Palais Royal, the young lawyer and journalist Camille Desmoulins leapt onto a cafe table and harangued the crowd. Waving a pistol and calling Parisians to arms, he urged them to defend the National Assembly and themselves against an imagined royal massacre. By evening, crowds had torn down royal symbols, attacked some customs posts at the city's gates, and erected improvised barricades. The next day, July 13th, violence and organization escalated side by side. Parisians stormed armories and tried to seize weapons. At the Hôtel de Ville, the city's traditional municipal headquarters, representatives of the 60 electoral districts that had chosen Paris's deputies met and began forming a new municipal authority and a bourgeois militia, soon to become the National Guard, to maintain order and protect the patriots. By the night of July 13th, the city was on the brink. Hungry, heavily armed crowds, rumors of royal troops marching on Paris, and no clear line between municipal reform and insurrection. At dawn on July 14th, the search for arms became systematic. Crowds converged on the Hôtel des Invalides, a sprawling complex housing retired soldiers and a large cache of weapons. Facing a vast and determined crowd, and without strong orders to resist, the Invalides' authorities yielded. Parisians seized around 32,000 muskets, artillery pieces, and other arms. But muskets without powder are little more than clubs. Word spread that the Bastille, an aging state prison and fortress on the eastern edge of the city, stored not only gunpowder and shot, but also stood as a visible symbol of royal arbitrariness. The decision was as much symbolic as practical. If Parisians could force the Bastille to yield, it would demonstrate that the old instruments of fear no longer held. The Bastille Saint-Antoine had been begun in the 14th century as a defensive fortress guarding the eastern approach to Paris. Over time, especially under Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIV, it became known less for its military role than for its function as a state prison. What made the Bastille notorious was not its size alone, but the way people could be confined there. through lettres de cachet, royal orders of arrest that often bypassed ordinary legal procedures. Men could be imprisoned for political offenses, seditious writings, or even at their family's request for scandalous behavior, with no public trial date in sight. By the 18th century, the Bastille's reality did not always match its fearful reputation. Conditions varied, and some high-status prisoners enjoyed relatively comfortable lodgings. Famous figures such as Voltaire had been confined there earlier in the century. By 1789, the Bastille housed only 7 prisoners. For forgers, 2 men classified as insane, and 1 aristocrat, the Comte de Salages. The fortress had more guards than inmates, but its symbolic weight far exceeded its head count. For reformers, it represented the shadowy, arbitrary side of absolute monarchy. For Parisians on July 14th, it was a visible target. Late in the morning and shortly after noon, a growing crowd of Parisians gathered in front of the Bastille. Artisans from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, shopkeepers, journeymen, small merchants, and an increasing number of soldiers from the Gardes Françaises, a French Guards regiment that had begun to sympathize with the people and defy officers' orders. From among the insurgents, leaders emerged. Pierre-Augustin Hulin, a factory foreman with prior military experience, took charge of some of the artillery and overall coordination. Jacob Jacques Elia, an officer of the bourgeois militia, also stepped forward as a prominent figure. They were not professional revolutionaries. They were Parisians pushed into leadership by circumstance and necessity. Inside the Bastille, the governor, Bernard-René Delaunay, commanded a garrison of about 100 men, a mix of Swiss mercenaries and elderly or disabled veterans, invalids. His orders from Versailles were ambiguous: defend the fortress, but avoid unnecessary bloodshed, and do not provoke a full-scale uprising. Initially, representatives from the crowd approached to negotiate. They demanded the surrender of the gunpowder and the withdrawal of the Bastille's cannon, some of which were oriented toward the nearby working-class district of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Delaunay received them cautiously, stalling for time and unsure whether relief from royal troops might still arrive. Outside, hours dragged on. More people poured into the streets. Tension thickened. At some point in the early afternoon, as negotiations faltered and the crowd pressed closer, a shot rang out. Its exact origin remains disputed, whether from nervous defenders inside, from someone in the crowd, or even accidental. What is clear is that once gunfire began, the fragile barrier between parley and battle collapsed. Musket volleys erupted from the Bastille's walls and courtyards. Some in the crowd fell dead or wounded. Outrage surged through the ranks of the besiegers. They dragged forward the cannon they had captured from the invalids, positioning them against the fortress's outer defenses. The Bastille was formidable, but not impregnable. Its medieval design faced an urban neighborhood rather than a battlefield, and its supply situation was not prepared for a prolonged siege. As hours passed, smoke and noise filled the area. The attackers brought ladders, hacked at chains, and sought to cut through or blow open gates. At intervals, some of the fortress's defenders tried to signal ceasefire, hanging white flags or calling out. Confusion reigned. Messages were misinterpreted, shots continued, and the killing went on. By mid-afternoon, casualties had mounted on both sides, but the initiative belonged increasingly to the crowd. Some of Delaunay's men, fearing massacre if they continued to resist, pressed him to capitulate. Around 5 p.m., after hours of intense struggle, a crucial barrier gave way. The outer drawbridge over the Bastille's moat was lowered or collapsed, whether by the defenders attempting to admit negotiators or by attackers forcing it is still debated, but the effect was the same. The besiegers surged across. Fighting continued in the courtyards, but the fortress's defenses were effectively breached. Recognizing that continued resistance meant certain slaughter of his garrison, Delaunay agreed to surrender, reportedly under assurances that his men would be spared. To be continued.